All right, let's jump straight into this explainer and unlock the hidden architectural blueprint of covenants, typologies, and family bloodlines buried deep within Genesis chapters 1 through 11. It's easy to read these early chapters as isolated stories, but when we actually map out the source material, this massive interconnected masterpiece just reveals itself. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the architecture of the covenant, look at the two competing family lines, and see Noah as the new Adam. Then we'll cover renewing the covenant, the Shem paradox, and wrap up with the literary framework. So moving right into section 1, architecture of the covenant from Adam to Christ. Notice how God's covenant deliberately expands here. It starts off super intimately, right? Just a single marriage with Adam. But it doesn't stop there. It grows to an entire household with Noah, creating this direct historical trajectory. Each covenant literally builds on the last, widening that circle of inclusion, until it ultimately culminates with Christ on the cross, embracing all of humanity. To really grasp how this works, we need to define our terms. The Hebrew word brith translates to covenant. Now, we kind of have to unlearn our modern idea of a contract. A contract is just an exchange of property or services. But a brith? It's an exchange of persons. It represents a sacred, binding family bond established by God. It is literally the divine mechanism God uses to repeatedly refuse abandoning humanity to death. All right, section 2. Two competing family lines and this spiritual conflict. We see a pretty stark contrast forming here. Over on one side, you've got Cain's exiled line. This lineage is marked by absolute defiance, brutally peaking in the 7th generation with a guy named Lamech, recorded as the first bigamist and a boastful murderer. But then, on the flip side, we have Seth's righteous line. This one culminates in its own 7th generation with Enoch, who, as the text beautifully puts it, simply walked with God. And this brilliantly illustrates what St. Augustine later called the two cities matrix. You can clearly see how Cain and later Ham's lines are driven by this core desire to establish their own name. That results in earthly power grabs like the Tower of Babel, ultimately destined for the city of man. Meanwhile, Seth and Shem's lines, they're totally focused on advancing the Lord's name, which results in the covenant family and is ultimately destined for the city of God. So the whole crux of this hinges on one single incredibly powerful Hebrew word, Shem. It literally translates to name. The entire conflict in these early chapters revolves around this. The wicked lines are desperately trying to make a Shem for themselves, a self-made legacy of pride. But the righteous lines, they aren't trying to make a name. They call upon the holy Shem of the Lord. But things go totally sideways when these lines cross. When the sons of God, which represents Seth's righteous line, intermingle with the daughters of men from Cain's worldly line, they compromise their covenant, and the result? They produce what the text calls men of renown, or, quite literally, men of the Shem. This pursuit of a self-made legacy corrupts everything, ultimately leading to a world so filled with violence that God has to hit the hard reset button. Which brings us to section 3, Noah as the new Adam and seeing the flood as a reboot. To prove this isn't just some random accident, but a highly calculated new creation drawn right out of the watery deep, the biblical text leans heavily on a specific number, the numerology of 7. And this is a totally deliberate echo of the original 7-day creation week back in Genesis 1. Just look at how ordered this timeline is. The flood begins after exactly 7 days. Noah boards 7 pairs of every clean animal. Later, he sends out a bird every 7 days. And to top it off, the ark finally comes to rest in the 7th month. So this isn't chaos at all. It's a highly structured, divine reboot of the cosmos. The parallels here are just mind-blowing. God treats Noah exactly like a second Adam. They get the exact same mandate, be fruitful and multiply. They're both given dominion over the animals. Adam gets a garden sanctuary to inhabit, while Noah plants a vineyard. And then, tragically, both experience a devastating fall involving fruit that ends in exposed nakedness. I mean, the typology is absolutely perfect. Moving on to section 4, renewing the covenant and the mechanics of salvation. Genesis 6:18 outlines this really specific 3-step method that actually sets the pattern for the rest of salvation history. First, we have the verb. God uses the Hebrew word hikim, meaning to establish or uphold. Crucially, this implies renewing an existing bond, the one broken by Adam, not just inventing a brand new one from scratch. Second, the sign. God sets up the rainbow as this enduring visual marker. And third, the method. The covenant is solemnly sealed through animal sacrifice the moment Noah leaves the ark. Theologically, this flood narrative is doing some major heavy lifting. It acts as the ultimate typology for the Christian sacrament of baptism. Think about it. Just as the floodwaters destroyed a sinful world to bring about a new cleansed earth, baptism uses water to destroy sin and create a new human soul. But as the source points out, with the subsequent fall of Noah's son Ham, simply passing through the waters alone doesn't assure ultimate salvation without our ongoing cooperation with God's plan. Let's check out Section 5, the Shem Paradox, Babel versus the Blessed Family. Okay, remember that Hebrew word Shem we talked about, meaning name? Well, Ham's rebellious descendants decide to build this massive, towering spire of Babel specifically to establish their own Shem. But God judges that arrogance. And the real paradox here? He chooses to bless and reach the rest of humanity not through some giant pagan monument, but through a humble, obedient family line descended from a guy literally named Shem. This whole dynamic splits the famous Table of Nations in Genesis 10 right down the middle. Out of Noah's 70 descendants, we get two totally distinct paths. The righteous line of Shem, the Semites, flows straight down through Eber to the Hebrews, the Israelites, and eventually to Jesus of Nazareth. Meanwhile, Ham's line diverges and literally produces all the historical ancient enemies of Israel. We're talking the Egyptians, Canaanites, Philistines, Assyrians, and Babylonians. Finally, Section 6, the literary framework, bridging the generations. Let's introduce our last key term to see how this builds the entire structural framework of the text. It's meticulously organized around the Hebrew word toledeth, meaning generations or account of. The author uses it like a structural marker, almost like a modern chapter heading, to smoothly divide and organize the history into distinct eras. And here's where the math gets really cool. The author uses this word exactly 10 times. This creates a highly deliberate, symmetrical bridge across time. If you count them, it's exactly 10 generations from Adam to Noah, wrapping up with the judgment of the flood, and then it is exactly 10 generations from Noah to Terah and Abram, culminating in the judgment of Babel and the calling of Abraham. It's this incredible literary framework proving that God is totally in control of history. And this overarching architecture of salvation actually matters deeply today. It's not just ancient history. Because, as the Catechism beautifully reminds us in paragraph 58, the covenant established with Noah remains in force for all nations, during the times of the Gentiles, even right now, until the universal proclamation of the gospel is complete. God's blueprint from the very beginning was always meant to hold the entire world together. We've really just scratched the surface here today. We've decoded those typologies, mapped out the bloodlines, and revealed the expanding architecture of the covenants. So the final question I want to leave you with is this. Armed with this totally new lens, what other hidden brilliance are you going to discover the next time you open the text? Keep exploring, and we'll catch you on the next explainer.